Welcome. We love working with Acton, and many of us are personal supporters of Acton and have been a long time. In fact, we sort of consider the Acton Institute to be our kissing cousin in matters ideological, and that language has been approved by Father Sirico. I assure you, he first used that at a Mackinac Center event. So it's great to see so many friends from Acton and so many Mackinac Center supporters. It is my pleasure to introduce Lawrence Reed, who likes to go by Larry, to all of his friends who you all are. And I get to introduce someone not in the usual way. You see, Larry does have a resume that is stuffed with all of the usual honorary and dignified stuff, all the degrees that you might expect, including honorary ones. And but I'm going to talk a little bit about why I wanted to be the one to introduce Larry today, why I wanted to. Larry really is a teacher at heart, and he was my mentor and friend for the 13 plus years that we worked together closely at the Mackinac Center. Before that, he was a professor of economics at Northwood University, and he pulled off the impossible. He made the dismal science exciting to students. And Larry had a passion for freedom, a passion to change the world that the classroom could not contain. And he decided he would run for Congress. Well, getting elected to Congress is probably the best thing that never happened to Larry. And he channeled this love for freedom into making himself a globe-trotting champion of free enterprise. In fact, one journalist in Michigan called him the Indiana Jones of Michigan. And when I think the last time I introduced Larry, I think the number was 69 countries, and of course every state. Larry has traveled and spoken and worked in scores of nations, many of which were behind the Iron Curtain before it fell. And although Larry is not a founder of the Mackinac Center, Larry Reed is the man who put the Mackinac Center on the map. And many of you who support Mackinac, I bet a lot of you began supporting Mackinac because of Larry when he was president. And he gave me my start in the freedom business back when I used to be an engineer in a former career. Now, the three of us, there were three of us who had a special relationship at the Mackinac Center. And it was Larry Reed and the late, great Joe Overton and myself. And Larry has written many books, and one book he wrote, he dedicated to our friend and co-worker Joe Overton. That book is called Striking the Root. So Larry writes books, I get to write forewords to Larry's books. And in my foreword, I described how the three of us worked together. Larry could come up with 1 million great ideas, but they always had to be accomplished in the next 5 minutes. And Joe Overton could come up with 1 million great ideas, and they all required a 10-year master plan. And it was my job to say no to both of them most of the time and to wrestle their ideas back to earth. And so for this, Larry fired me. Larry got in the habit of firing me. And I figured out that if I just kept coming back to work, there really wasn't anything he could do about it. Larry realized that he couldn't get rid of me by making me leave the Mackinac Center, so he left the Mackinac Center after being its president for 20 years, which is when he became president of the Foundation for Economic Education, the oldest free market think tank in the country. He took that role in 2008. And because I'm here today introducing him, he knows he still can't get rid of me. So please help me welcome Larry Reed, who will talk about his new book, Excuse Me, Professor, Challenging the Myths of Progressivism.
Thank you. Thanks, Joe. Terrific. Just terrific. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's always a delight to come back to Michigan. My home is in Georgia now, but my heart is still here. And I think of Michigan a lot and the many friends I have made here over the years. And I also want to pay a special tribute to the Acton Institute and the Mackinac Center. They are the two favorite the most favorite think tanks of mine in the world. not only because I was with one formerly for 20 years, but also because we both share such eternal and vitally important principles and work hard to convey those to audiences all over the world. So thanks for this opportunity, both Mackinac and Acton, and thanks to all of you for coming. I should give you fair warning before I get going into this talk today, because I'm going to say something at the outset that is controversial. It certainly is not politically correct, and some people find it offensive. But I'm going to say it anyway, and I hope I have readied you for what I'm about to say. Merry Christmas. I love saying that. I start saying it even before Thanksgiving every year. And if anybody indicates that they're unhappy when I've said it, I always follow up very quickly and say, well, Merry Christmas anyway. Well, today I want to talk to you about Excuse Me, Professor, the book that we published this past August. It's done very well. I've been very pleased and a bit surprised at how popular the book has been, and I'm very happy to give all of you a copy of it today. The other pamphlet that we have for you today that Mike mentioned, Rendering Unto Caesar Was Jesus a Socialist? A condensed version of that, about half the size, is actually a chapter in Excuse Me, Professor. I later expanded it, and then we published it as the monograph that we have for you. So please don't leave today without a copy of each to take with you. The book is organized in 3 sections. Even though the sections aren't formally delineated with unit headings in the book, it's 52 chapters without indicating where there's a transition from one section to the other. But as you go through it, you will note that the first roughly third of the book approaches myths and misconceptions about people and policies from a largely philosophical nature. It examines elements of human nature that often define the distinctions between progressives and other people and how they see the world. The second section deals with historical myths and misconceptions, almost entirely in American history, although there's a little bit beyond as well. And then the last third, roughly, talks about current issues. And so that's roughly the way I'm going to divide this talk up today, by selecting a few of the topics covered in those 52 chapters under those general section headings. The purpose of the book, by the way, was to primarily arm young people. Although we've been delighted at the response from people of all ages, it's really applicable for any purpose by any people of any age. But the main focus was to give young people at colleges the armament, the intellectual armament that they need to do battle with their progressive professors, of which there are more than just a few. So each chapter is a myth or misconception propagated by those of a progressive persuasion with what I'd like to think is a pretty thorough rebuttal, one after another. The first one that I want to deal with is the matter of income inequality. How many have heard that phrase before? Yeah, it is big time, isn't it? You're going to hear a lot more over the next year during the presidential campaign. I'm sure at least one of the major party nominees is going to make it a big issue. And we'll be talking about the fact that some people have more in a material sense than others, and that something needs to be done about that by government. I come at this in multiple chapters, not all written by me. I've assembled some written by others as well, but we come at it from different angles. This is a good opportunity for me to point out something that characterizes progressives all too often. They tend to take a situation, a moment, a crisis, whatever, and assume from there that nothing preceded it. If they observe, say, income inequality, well then, we don't have to ask questions like, might it have been something we did that caused it? Or might there have been something that preceded it that needs to be fixed, if it is in fact a problem? They just start with a problem. You'll see this as a theme through some of these other myths as well, and then almost invariably advocate some further intrusion or activity of government as a way to solve it. I'd like to think that this book is an antidote in many respects, and in one in particular, in that it tries to fix the fundamentals. It deals with issues at their root, and starts by asking such things as, what was the history of this matter that you have identified as a possible problem? Progressives rarely do that. They just, if it's a crisis in the economy, if it's a depression or a recession, they sort of start as if nothing preceded it. We just need to act now as if there was nothing to be learned from what may have led up to it. This is the way they look at economic inequality. If somebody had told me, let's say 50 years or more ago, if somebody said, Larry, we're going to put you in charge of a national matter. Your job, and we'll come back in 50 years and see how well you've done, your job is to exacerbate income inequality. Do something that will make incomes vastly different and for the gap between the rich and the poor to widen. So you come up with policies that will accomplish that. I think with what I know about economics, I would have done this. I would have said, well, one thing we can do is let's continue to raise the minimum wage as high as we can at every opportunity, because then we can price some people out of work altogether. They tend to be the least skilled, least experienced to begin with. And if we price them out of a job, they'll have even less. And so those who have jobs will comparatively have more. That'll make for more income inequality. I would have put that on the list of things to do. I would have said, furthermore, well, let's have bailouts whenever we have a crisis in the economy, and let's target those bailouts not on the little guy, but on the big guys, the politically well-connected, the already well-to-do. That'll exacerbate income inequality. Let's also add regulations, as many as we can get, across a broad front of economic sectors of the economy. Impose all kinds of regulations. That'll exacerbate income inequality because those with the lower incomes will be able to fend off those regulations the least well. The already well-to-do, politically connected, and well-established, they'll have the legal departments to deal with them. We can make it tougher for people to start businesses, and so if they never get a start, that'll keep them poor. And then the already existing firms will comparatively have more income. I would have done all that. Well, in fact, we did do that, and so much more, and yet you have the very same people who supported a lot of those kinds of policies, and then some, things including erratic Federal Reserve policy that tends to, if it benefits anybody, it tends to be the better off, not the lower income segments of society. We did all of that at the behest of many of those people who complain the most about economic inequality today, but they almost never talk about that. Have you noticed that? They just assume, well, we suddenly have a problem, we got to fix it, and let's not fix it by first asking, how did we get here? Did we do anything that may have made the problem or made it worse than it might otherwise have been? There's so much more that can be said, though, about this issue of economic inequality, and I'll just touch on a few important elements. I think we have to understand, as I've written in a lot of other places, that free people are not going to be equal economically. And people who are equal economically are not going to be free. What do I mean by that? If people are free, lo and behold, they tend to generate differences in incomes because we're not robots. We're not the same from one person to another. The very fact that we are unique and different across a broad front of character traits and other circumstances tends to generate economic inequality. We're different in terms of the talents that we possess. We're different in terms of when we recognize what our best and highest talents are. Some people don't discover those talents until late in life and then really go to town, make up for lost time perhaps. But talent alone would tend to generate differences of income among a people who themselves are not the same. Another reason we're different is the fact that we have different degrees of industriousness. Some people work harder and longer and smarter than other people. Surely that must be a significant reason for differences in outcomes in the marketplace. We don't all bring to the table the same products or traits or skills or experiences. And because of that reason alone, we generate differences in income. And finally, another reason, I shouldn't say finally because there are many others, but the last one I'll mention, is our savings. If you equalized everybody's income tonight, so that everybody in a material sense, before they went to bed, had the same amount of material wealth, they were now reaping the same paychecks, everybody was earning the same regardless of their contributions to the marketplace, you would have inequality by noon tomorrow for this third reason alone, because some of us would save it and some of us would spend it. So this idea of that people should be more equal, or the most radical egalitarian version, we should all be equal in a material sense, is illusory, and it runs counter to human nature. And it also tends to deal with people and their incomes in very unrealistic ways. I want to quote from one of the chapters here. This is from Professor Don Boudreau, who teaches at George Mason University and is one of my predecessors as president of FEE. He points out, quote, differences in assets are not the same as differences in living standards, though people tend to fetishize the former. Bill Gates' wealth may be about 70,000 times greater than mine. But does Bill Gates ingest 70,000 times more calories than me? Hope not. Are Bill Gates' meals 70,000 times tastier? Are his children educated 70,000 times better? Can he travel to Europe or to Asia 70,000 times faster or more safely? Will he live 70,000 times longer than me? Today, Professor Boudreau says, even the poorest segment in America live better than almost anyone in the 18th century and better than 2/3 of the rest of today's world population. What's ultimately, I think, the most important matter to consider when we discuss economic inequality is the matter of income mobility. You could take a snapshot of one moment in time and say, some people have more than others. And maybe you can leap to broad conclusions, or some certainly will, about what needs to be done about it. But that's a little like stopping a horse race in the middle and being horrified that one of the horses is ahead. The race isn't over yet. And in the marketplace of productivity and incentive and growth and opportunity, that race really never ends. So the question is, what kind of a economy do we have when it comes to mobility? Are we somehow frozen in place so that your income level at age 20 will likely remain the same when you're age 50? A free economy is not such a place. A free economy is one that offers opportunity, and that's why you find far more mobility up the economic ladder in free economies than you'll ever find in controlled, top-down, centrally planned economies, where income equality is often a trumpeted phrase, but they neither never achieve it nor even achieve the kinds of higher standards of living that are possible in a free society. So there's a lot about income inequality that's off base. I've given you only a taste of how we deal with that particular chapter, but enough hopefully to make you want to read some more. I think there are 3 chapters in the book that deal from various angles with that particular myth. A second matter concerns the balance of trade. We've all heard reports about the balance of trade, usually presented in a kind of ominous way. Oh, America's trade deficit rose this month. That's always presented as if it's a bad thing. A trade deficit simply means that more merchandise has entered the country as a part of international trade transactions. More merchandise has entered the country in some period of time than has left the country, and through exports. And going back to the days of the old mercantilists of the 17th century, you have this automatic bias that persists to this day, that a trade deficit is bad and that its opposite, a trade surplus, must by definition be good. It must be better to ship more goods out than you have coming back. Frederick Bastiat, who was a great French economist of the first half of the 19th century, dealt with this brilliantly in a number of ways. One of my favorite Bastiat stories is of an exporter from France, where Bastiat was born. And according to this story, this exporter loads up his boats with about 150,000 francs worth of stuff, whatever it was he was producing. And of course, before he leaves the port and heads for America to sell it, he has to get a record on the customs house books of what's going out. So the customs agent makes note, okay, 100,000 francs worth of stuff leaving the country. The guy comes over to America and strikes some pretty good deals, and he sells it all for the equivalent of about 200,000 francs worth of stuff. And he's bringing that back now feeling pretty good. Wow, this is a whole idea of being in business. It wouldn't make sense if I took 150,000 francs worth of stuff out and brought back the same or less. He's feeling like he's a pretty good businessman. He goes through the customs house at the port, again in France. The customs agent makes note, you're bringing 200,000 francs of stuff. Uh-oh, balance of trade deficit. You've contributed to the national balance of trade deficit because you're bringing back more than you took out. That's a trade surplus. We can't have that. That's bad. Or a trade deficit. That's bad. Of course, if you take that to its logical conclusion, as Bastiat did, then we'd all be a wealthier society if we just shipped everything we make out and let nothing come back. We just drain the country of goods and accept no goods in return. Then we'd have a massive balance of trade surplus and we'd all starve. But Bastiat, in his little story, went a bit further. He said, okay, so the next time the guy loads up his boat with 150,000 francs worth of stuff. He gets it recorded on the customs house books, but he's just a few miles out to sea, and the French government sends the Navy out there and they sink his ship. Now what do the books show at the customs house? 150,000 francs worth of stuff left, 0 came back, balance of trade surplus. Let's do that again. Okay. If you look at trade from the standpoint of those who actually engage in it, the ones who actually grow the stuff, produce the stuff, load the boats with the stuff, sell the stuff, trade for other things, bring the other stuff back, sell it again, from the standpoint of those who are actually doing the thing that gives rise to the numbers, they're all saying, well, I wouldn't have done it had I not been better off after having done it. This was a good thing. It's only from the standpoint of these distant third parties with their pencil pushing duties that this could ever be regarded as a negative thing, which is why I've always said, yes, there are competitiveness issues. Yes, there are bad policies that make American industry less competitive than it otherwise might be. Yes, there are things that government should do to basically back off and allow more trade to happen. But the balance of trade problem is a problem that would go away if we just fired the people who compile the numbers. I personally have a balance of trade deficit with Walmart. I consistently buy more from them than they buy from me. But I'm not complaining, and neither are they. If Alaska were suddenly to secede and become a separate state, or a separate country, and the trade patterns were to remain the same, all of a sudden we'd be reporting balance of trade deficits, the other 49 states with Alaska, in many of the recent years of trade history. But nobody compiles the numbers, they're part of us, so we don't care, and everybody seems to get by just fine. So the balance of trade is one of these myths that not only progressives, but other people bring up and invariably use as a means to argue for things like protectionism and other intrusions that would, with almost no exception, make us worse off than before. How many of you have read or were forced to read as a youngster Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle? Okay, this is the next one I want to deal with here. Well, whether you've read it or not, you probably know how that book and its message has been used over the years by progressives. It is presented as, well, it's the definitive, certainly one of the earliest, if not the most definitive, critique of capitalism unfettered You can't have meat packers, these greedy, profit-hungry meat packers, tainting meat and selling it to the American people. We had to have the Meat Inspection Act of 1906 to deal with this awful problem. Upton Sinclair proved it in his book. And if you just sift through those few pages in the book where he focuses on alleged conditions in the meatpacking plants in Chicago, you would be horrified. If you thought for a moment that this was really descriptive of reality, you couldn't help but be horrified. He writes in there about workers in the meatpacking plants falling into these large vats and being ground up with the meat into meat products and so forth. And I mean, wow, how could you read that and not say some regulation is needed? Well, that's the way I heard it first in high school, that Upton Sinclair, he just laid the free market low. You can't have that. And of course, if that really had happened, I would advocate some sort of redress of grievances, some process through law where you could go after those who had done such things. But you have to know that Upton Sinclair was a propagandist, first and foremost. This was a novel, not a documentary. It never happened. When I first started researching this some years ago, I thought, well, you know, all these men that he talks about being ground up into Durham's pure leaf lard and stuff like that, I want to find out who they were. Surely there are monuments to them somewhere. They'd be progressive icons, right? We'd have statues. Oh, you know, Joe so-and-so, look what happened to him. You know, and I couldn't find, I wanted to find their names. I wonder, who were these people? Didn't somebody come forth and say, hey, what happened to Bob? Didn't somebody say, you know, Jim didn't come home from work. Well, that's all right, we'll just eat him. I mean, who were these people? Well, you don't find them because they didn't exist. It never happened. He was given $500, Upton Sinclair, by the Socialist International, I think was the group. I got the precise name, if that's not it, in the book, to write a book that would help advance the goals of socialism. So he cooked up a lot of stuff, spent almost no time in the meatpacking plants. And one of the important things to know is we did have government meat inspection before the Meat Inspection Act of 1906 that followed on the heels of Upton Sinclair's book. You can go through the congressional record, as I did, and read the debates over the Meat Inspection Act of 06, pushed forward after Sinclair's book came out as a remedy. And you can go through those debates. It's not classified information. And you can see congressmen saying, wait a minute, what happened to the inspection that we had? Federal and state inspectors all over Chicago. Were they asleep at the switch? Or were they complicit? Were they taking bribes? I mean, how come it took a novelist with no experience and minimal knowledge of the meatpacking plants? How come it took a novelist to expose these things if in fact they were true? Even President Roosevelt said that the man was off balance and a notorious liar. And the really curious thing about the Meat Inspection Act is who ended up supporting it in the end. Your typical history text implies, if not outright states, that the meat packers fought it all the way to the end and opposed it, but we triumphed over their greed and passed the Meat Inspection Act. They supported it. You know why? Because the Meat Inspection Act of 1906 took them off the hook when it came to the bill, paying the bill for meat inspection, and shifted it to the shoulders of the taxpayer. So thank you so much. We had meat inspection, it was working fine, and this guy writes a novel, it leads to a new law. The meat packers themselves supported it because now millions of dollars in inspection gets to be paid for by taxpayers instead of the meat packers in an effort to prove that their product was sound. Just the opposite of what we often hear. Wouldn't you say? How many heard this perspective on that act at any time in your schooling years? Yeah, I didn't either. Another myth concerns the Great Depression, and some of you probably heard me talk about this. I think I talked about it all over Michigan while I was here for all those years. So I'll only condense it here, but this is a big one. Progressives are fond of referring back to the calamity of the 1930s, and in one form or another they say the free market caused it, a Great Depression that started in 1929, the free market, unfettered capitalism, stock speculators, profit-hungry, greedy capitalists, in some way or other started it. government was an innocent bystander, but then had to come in to rescue us. And it had to come in the person of Franklin Roosevelt, because Herbert Hoover was just one of these stand pat, do nothing, laissez-faire, mean-spirited people who wouldn't intervene on behalf of starving people. In one form or another, that's the version you get, and so many young people get in today's high schools and colleges. Nothing could be further from the truth. To condense this sad but long story, the Great Depression was not the first in American history, but it was the deepest, and it was by far the longest. We'd had one just a few years before, in 1921, but we hardly remember it. There's a recent book out I highly recommend by James Grant that deals with the Depression of 1921. I think it's called The Forgotten Depression. And he talks about how in 1921 we had a very sharp downturn. After years of paper money inflation to help accommodate the bills of World War I, this monetary policy of currency debasement to help pay the government's bills, cover its deficits to pay for World War I, led directly to a sharp downturn in 1921, but we hardly remember it because it was so quick. It was over. It was over in a matter of months. We had double-digit unemployment. It would have gone down as the Great Depression if it had lasted even as much as a couple years, but it was over with in less than a year. Why? That was the last depression in American history that the U.S. government dealt with in what I would regard as an appropriate fashion. It didn't quite admit that it was the cause of it because of its previous monetary policy. I would have preferred that it do that. But when the Depression started, the government didn't step on the gas, immediately reinflate. It didn't get into the business of massive bailouts for companies. In fact, in the Harding and Coolidge years, federal spending was reduced, the national debt was reduced by a third, tax rates were cut, regulations were reduced, and what happened was the government essentially backed off of a sick economy and allowed it to recover, and it did in very short order. Then we forget about that. 1929 to 1945, a 16-year depression, was a very different story. I know you might be thinking, well, didn't it end in 41? Well, by any measure of living standards, it didn't. In fact, if anything, they stagnated, maybe even declined by some measures in the war years. Unemployment came way down during the war, but that's in part because we drafted 11 million men, sent them overseas, and didn't count them in the unemployment figures. That made those official numbers look much better. But we never really recovered from the Great Depression in any sustainable way until 1945. But I haven't told you what brought it on in the first place. Was it unfettered free markets? From 1924 until late 1928, the Federal Reserve System, the nation's central bank, engineered a very substantial inflation of money and credit. Now, we had some good things happening that helped to offset the price effects of this monetary inflation. We had the Coolidge tax cuts that helped to spur productivity, for instance. But the Federal Reserve expanded money and credit by some 65%. It drove interest rates to an all-time low. What do we call this period? The Roaring '20s. We had all the classic signs of a bubble in the economy fueled by easy money, by rock-bottom interest rates as the Fed was flushing the banks with tons of money, of reserves that brought interest rates to historic lows for a number of years. There was a land boom in Florida. Does that sound familiar? During this easy money period, a housing boom. But it all began to come apart when the Federal Reserve in late '28 began to shift its policy. Not many people saw it. You had to know where to look. But the ever lower interest rate policy shifted now to an ever higher one. And it had the effect over a matter of months of nipping the boom in the bud, of deflating the bubble, you might say. The smart money, the Joseph P. Kennedys, the Bernard Baruchs, by the middle of 1930, they saw the change. They said, hey, we had all these years of dirt cheap interest rates, easy money, roaring '20s, but now the Fed has taken the punch away from the party. It's raising interest rates fairly dramatically. In fact, it will triple them between 1929 and 31. So interest rates now marching upward, money supply is being choked off. After a 65% expansion, the Fed will preside between 1929 and 33 over a 1/3 reduction in the nation's money supply. That's much bigger than they were expecting or planned for. It got out of hand. But when that house of cards came tumbling down, so did the rest of the economy. The start of the Great Depression is the direct result of monetary policy. Easy money. You have a roller coaster in monetary policy. Expansion, easy money, low interest rates. Then they move in the other direction, knocking the bottom layer out from under the house of cards. But if nothing else had happened, maybe 1930 could have been a year of recovery. This might have gone down as a quick, short downturn, no big deal. But then in 1930, President Hoover, and the Republican Congress, at that time Republicans, much less so today, but at that time they were the protectionist party. The Democrats had historically been the freer trade party. The Republicans decide, well, we got this nagging unemployment, it's 8.5%. That's not a depression yet, by the way. That's only a recession. By the spring of 1930, we just had a recession. The stock market already had rebounded and lost half of the ground that it had lost the previous fall. But in June of 1930, the president signs into law the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which raises tariffs to all-time highs against foreign imports and virtually closes the border. The theory was if we make foreign goods a lot more expensive by adding tariffs to them, well, then Americans will say, we don't want to buy that stuff. We'll buy stuff made in America, and that'll put those unemployed people back to work. That was the theory. What they didn't understand was that you can't shut the door to exports without sooner or later shutting the door to, or you can't shut the door to imports without sooner or later shutting the door to exports. Trade is ultimately a two-way street. If foreigners can't sell here because our taxes on their goods are so high, how can they earn the dollars they need to buy here? If the boat never comes with fill in the blank, the boat never leaves with American agricultural goods, let's say. Agriculture was, in fact, the industry perhaps hit the hardest because of the Smoot-Hawley tariff. Farmers had been producing a great deal for overseas markets. About 1/3 of what they produced on the farm was being sold overseas. But now foreigners couldn't sell their goods here. So they didn't load up the boats in American ports with the soybeans and so forth that would normally go back overseas to Europe or to Asia. So American farmers find plummeting farm prices, 1/3 of their markets wiped out by Smoot-Hawley, plummeting prices, and farm bankruptcies soar. If you look at bank failures at the time, they tend to be concentrated not in the big cities, and certainly not among the biggest of banks, but among rural banks around the country who held the mortgages on the farms that now were going bankrupt in record numbers because of Smoot-Hawley. By the end of 1930, we had taken that recession and made it a full-scale depression through federal policy. That's not laissez-faire, that's not the free market, that's intervention that taxed ourselves to death when it came to imports and exports. It was folly from the word go. And foreign governments added to it by retaliating. They said, if you're going to do it to our goods, we're going to do it to your goods. So Smoot-Hawley ignited a trade war. And any industry that was dependent upon the flow of trade tended to be hit, maybe in some cases, very, very hard. Then in 1932, with a full-scale depression, double-digit unemployment in the vicinity of 20+%, what do you suppose is happening to the federal budget? It's wildly out of whack, right? The Hoover administration didn't want to cut spending. In fact, Hoover was raising spending. He had his own bailout schemes, his Reconstruction Finance Corporation, what have you, throwing money at the economy in an effort to try to boost things. Spending goes up, revenue is going through the floor because of things like Smoot-Hawley, and they decide we better do something about this deficit. So in the face of a depression with double-digit unemployment, in 1932, they passed the Revenue Act, which doubled the income tax. Wouldn't you have thought of that, right? In the midst of a depression, hey, let's make it better. Let's rate this, double taxes. The top income tax rate was raised by more than a doubling. It went from 24 to 65%. Excise taxes almost across the board were dramatically increased and new ones imposed. So then we have a big presidential election in 32, and what does the progressive myth have us believe? Hoover had not done anything to help people. And he was just a stand back, laissez-faire, do-nothing president. Do nothing? He just raised tariffs, doubled the income tax. So many other things were very harmful. The Democrats nominate Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who runs on a platform that called for, this is in the Democratic Party platform of 1932. He not only didn't repudiate it, he reiterated it on many occasions. It called for a 25% reduction in federal spending. He attacked Hoover for, quote, presiding over the greatest taxing and spending administration in American history. He was exactly right. If you had been for small government in 32, you probably would have voted for Franklin Roosevelt. Norman Thomas was running as a socialist. He was saying Hoover hadn't gone far enough. Roosevelt was the one promising freer markets, less government, 25% reduction in federal spending. His vice presidential nominee, John Nance Garner, accused Hoover of, quote, taking the country down the path to socialism. But progressives will never tell you that. So we elect Franklin Roosevelt on a platform of less government, and he promptly gives us a lot more of it. And then we got the New Deal. I don't want to belabor all this because it's all in the book, but with the New Deal, we got a prolongation of the Depression by at least 7 years. We got laws like the National Industrial Recovery Act, which tried to cartelize American industry, imposing price controls and punishments if people cut their prices. There's a famous case I reference in the book of a tailor in New Jersey or New York named Jack Megid. He was prosecuted under the NIRA because he pressed a suit of clothes for 35 cents instead of the NRA mandated code price of 40 cents. Well, there's a way to recover an economy, right? You go after the tailors who give you a good deal on cleaning your clothes because they didn't charge you even more than they did. And yet we were doing that all across the economy. It was extraordinarily depressing, as was the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, passed also in 33 under Roosevelt, which imposed a new tax on agriculture. What can you say about that? They're flat on their back, thousands of farmers having left in bankruptcy, and now we impose a new tax on agriculture and use the money to supervise the destruction of perfectly good fields of corn, wheat, and other crops, and the destruction of perfectly healthy cattle, sheep, and pigs in an effort to reduce supply and raise the price. Of course, yeah, you get a higher price for what's left, but you got left to sell. And even if this had helped the farmer, it could only have done so at the expense of everybody else. This is no general prescription for recovery. It's redistribution and reduction of wealth through force, the force of government. And it didn't help. And in later years, we have the Wagner Act with special powers given to labor unions that we still contend with today, and that raised the cost of doing business and led directly to the 1937 collapse, at which time Roosevelt achieved a depression within a depression in 1937. We really don't get genuine recovery until after the war, beginning in 45, and for two reasons. And these run afoul of progressive mythology as well, or ideology. Progressivism tells us that when government spends more, it by definition stimulates, as opposed to, if we left it in your pocket, because we're not smart enough to know how to stimulate an economy. Politicians know how to do that. And that when government spends less, it's supposed to hurt the economy. After 1945, we had the steepest decline in federal spending in American history, largely because of demobilization. And instead of a renewed depression, we got a boom. And furthermore, other factors were at work as well. And one of those is, with Roosevelt gone after he passed away in April of 45, Truman was pressured by Congress into approving a very substantial reduction in the corporate income tax rate. The top rate went in one fell swoop from 90% to 38% in 1945. Now I ask you, would that affect your behavior as a business person? If one day you're thinking, should I expand my plant, hire more people, take additional risk, build a new factory? If the government might take as much as 90% of your earnings, the next day they say, nope, most will take is 38. Yeah, I think wouldn't you start to look around and say, I might take a risk in that kind of an environment? That was a big help in 45. Well, I got to leave time for questions, so let me just real quick touch on the minimum wage and then a final issue, and hopefully still leave you at least 8 or 9 minutes. The minimum wage is so shrouded in myth and misconception, always has been from the beginning, but still promoted by progressives who are actively right now pushing for a $15 an hour federal minimum. And the assumption is that by decree, by simply saying it's going to be illegal to pay people less than a certain amount, will somehow make them worth at least that much. That in itself should leave you scratching your head. How do you make somebody worth a certain amount by making it illegal to pay him any less? Isn't he still worth the same? What happens to people if we make it $15 an hour? What happens to people who, because they're young, they're inexperienced, they lack skills, lack education, they're looking for the first rung on the economic ladder? What happens to them if they're really only worth $10 an hour when you declare 15 as the minimum? Do business people say, that's all right, I'll hire him anyway and just eat the $5 an hour loss? Not many do that. Not even progressive politicians do that. Or not even progressive people do that in any great number. They pay market wages too. You simply price people out of the labor market altogether when you decree a certain amount and no less. If $15 an hour made sense, if it actually helped people, then why do we settle for 15? Why don't we decree something? Why not make it $50 an hour? Why not just say, hey, nobody has to work, but we'll pay you anyway? This is magic wand thinking. This is, we just pass a law and decree things and people will be better off. Everybody will make 15 if we just tell them that's what they're going to get. It's almost infantile thinking, and yet it animates so much of progressive ideology today. If you're wondering, okay, having heard this talk, are you a progressive? I assume that there aren't many here, but I have in the last chapter identified some characteristics of progressives. I hope you don't think this is too harsh. It doesn't certainly describe every progressive, but certainly the most extreme it does. Here are 20 characteristics of real, true blue progressives. They spend more time promoting dependency than they do encouraging self-reliance. Number 2, deceptions, for example, if you like your health care plan, you can keep your health care plan. Deceptions don't rankle most of them because they believe their ends justify almost any means. 3, they think intentions matter far more than actual results. You ever notice that? If we just feel good, it sounds like we have good intentions, don't bother me with the outcomes. We just have good intentions. That's all that matters. 4, they lump people into groups and assign them fictitious rights. 5, they learn little or nothing from history or economics. 6, they think emotions, slogans, and bumper stickers trump reason and logic. 7, compassion is their favorite word, even as they put a gun to your head. 8, they respect property if it's theirs, but not if it's yours. 9, they'd rather shut you up than engage you in serious debate. Haven't we seen a lot of that lately on college campuses? Number 10, individuals are never among the minorities they say they support. Just groups. Number 11, when the first conservative or libertarian faculty member is hired at their university, they think it's a hostile takeover. Number 12, they think a welfare check is an entitlement, but a paycheck isn't. 13, when their policies flop, they assume no responsibility and demand more of the same. 14, they're always busy reforming you, even if their own lives may be dysfunctional. 15, they claim to know the future, for example, which industry to subsidize, what's the coming thing, while showing no evidence they even understand the past. 16, they dislike business less because they have sound arguments against it, and more because they have no idea how to start or run one themselves. 17, they criticize people and companies for not paying more in taxes than they're legally required to, yet never make any donations to government themselves beyond their own legal tax liability. You ever notice that? If you had a $1,000 windfall, maybe from the lottery, and you wanted to help people with it, would it even occur to you to write out a check to the Department of Health and Human Services? I mean, you'd give it to the Acton Institute or the Salvation Army or something like that. Even progressives don't make donations to the government. They want to get so much bigger. 18, they're angry most of the time, have no sense of humor, find victims under every bed, and can't even tell a joke that's reasonably funny. 19, they've perfected the fine art of the double standard, exempting their own from the very actions they criticize in others. And 20, they appeal to the worst in us by emphasizing racial divisions, pitting class against class, and buying votes with other people's money. Unfortunately, those who have fallen victim to much of that line of thinking are in charge of too many places and too many high points in American culture these days. Our struggle today is a struggle of ideas with people of progressive intentions. We have to work harder, we have to work smarter at educating people about the myths and misconceptions that progressives are perpetrating on us 24/7. Thank you so much, and if we have a little time, I'd be happy to take a few questions.
Thank you, Larry.
Thank you.
So we'll end right at 1:15. So we've got about 15 minutes, so please stay. We have a lot of questions. I do want to point out that if you did not get a book, Larry generously offered, he said to me, well, how many people show up? I said, well, I don't know, 70? Well, there's almost twice that here today. So if you didn't, we were giving them one per household. So if you did not get a book, fill out your comment card, put your name and your address, and just say did not get a book, and we'll make sure that you get one. Because I think the book is a great place to begin this education process. So questions, and I would ask if you could make your questions small and quick, and then we can get more of them. So.
And in the case of that shorter essay, was Jesus a socialist? I think we do have enough for everybody on that one. Yep.
Could you comment on the reams of bank regulation coming out of Washington, justified on the basis of the meltdown in 2007, 2008?
The question concerns the reams of regulations that have come out. You're probably referring primarily to the Barney Frank law, the Dodd-Frank law. Dodd-Frank, yeah. Again, there's Barney Fife, yeah. Well, yeah, written by Barney Fife, yeah. This is a beautiful example of the problem I cited at the start of this talk, how progressives sort of take a situation and never ask, what came before? Should we fix something we did before that may have contributed to it? They just said, oh, bank problems, so let's regulate banks. And I know that this is not an area that I've studied in great detail, but I do know that one of the most significant effects of the Dodd-Frank law is to put enormous pressure on smaller community banks. And so in that sense, it's kind of the opposite of what the stated intent was. The stated intent was to make the system less subject to failure, more, spread the risk or make our banking system sounder. But by driving out of business so many smaller and community banks, I don't think that makes our system any sounder. It makes us more dependent upon the remaining and often far larger banks than before. And it doesn't even begin to address what caused the last recession in any event, which was primarily two things. One, years of easy money from the Federal Reserve that kept interest rates at such lows, and a series of laws and regulations from Congress that jawboned the banks to make loans that could not be paid back, and often for political reasons.
We've had Medicare since 1964, and price controls on Part B providers since 1987 or 88. That's the physicians and labs. I wonder if you comment on what you think the effect of the price controls, which we continue to have, is on the total cost of the Medicare system.
Yeah. Price controls never make things cheaper. They may mask the real costs. They may make certain things look like they're cheaper, but then it results really in the shifting of costs to other sectors or costs that show up in different ways. Maybe an operation used to be $15,000 and a one-day wait. Now it's $12,000 because of a price edict of some sort and a 6-month wait. So the cost is no longer expressed purely in terms of dollars, but also in terms of longer waits. You see this in country after country that has socialized their medical systems. They end up, they like to say, oh, we got cheaper medical care now than would be the case if we hadn't done that. But they often never factor into the cost, such things as longer wait times, less in the way of new technology coming out, lower investment in new drugs that save lives and reduce hospitalizations and so forth. So price controls, I think, are never good. The moment you set a price below where it might otherwise be, you set into motion certain disincentives. Suppliers have less incentive to create and produce more or invest in more. Consumers have every reason to demand more, and the result is a shortage and lower quality care. So this is how government has tried time and again, although it's not working, to make Medicare costs more affordable. They suppress competition, they reduce compensation for providers, and then say, look what we did. But these things can never be judged only by the immediate and most apparent short-term effects. They have to be judged also by what's the long-term effect of a policy that discourages supply and that encourages demand. It's not good, never pretty.
I'm of the opinion that critical thinking isn't a core competency of enough people, and what you're describing are critical thinking skills about what the unintended consequences may be. So what do you think can be done to help either improve that or circle around and accomplish a good benefit without it?
Oh, you're absolutely right. Critical thinking skills, that's one of our, that and a character crisis are our two biggest real crises, but progressives don't talk much about either one. There are a number of ways to tackle it. One, I think, is by giving more people more choices in schooling. So many of the problems in education, in the form of lower quality or not teaching critical thinking skills, stem from the fact that we still have largely a government monopoly. Government is not going to, in the long run, educate you well, and it's not going to teach you character. You get more of both, I think, when you've got a competitive environment in which people can say, no thanks, I'm going to patronize this school instead, or if you don't keep standards high, I'm going to leave, and the money's going to go with me. Until you desocialize education, I don't see that we're going to see dramatic improvements. But ultimately, this all comes, we shouldn't look to government, even a better government, as the solution to all of our problems, especially when a lot of the solutions lie already within ourselves. We shouldn't have to wait to inculcate in our children the importance of critical thinking. We shouldn't have to wait until government gets around to doing it. We should be working on that ourselves. And in this day and age, with the internet, so many things that are accessible and so inexpensively, educational resources, there's no excuse for not making sure that your children are raised with the kind of skills the schools may not be teaching. Less and less excuse, anyway, for that. So it really comes back to taking charge, once again, of your life and those who are dependent upon you. Don't sit back and complain and wait for government to fix it for you or provide it for you. Never the answer.
Thank you. My name is Mike Farage. I have a group here, the Grand Rapids Taxpayers Association. We're almost constantly fighting like 4 tax increases a year. My question to you, it's kind of asking some advice. It used to be one side was for it and one side's against it. It now seems like the side that was usually with you, the GOP, it's almost like you're fighting both parties now because so many have just seemed to go off to the left. My question is, one of the best visits is a college campus because you have so many free-minded thinking people.
Yeah.
On that same token, the worst place to go is the college campuses. How is it that everything that you have said, it has been, even it seems like in private schools, have been totally shut out
Yeah.
of all the education system in general,
Yeah.
whereas there used to be a percentage educating on what you had just said.
Yeah.
And what would be your advice to me when I'm addressing someone who's already been told I'm a radical or an extremist and 1,000 other things I'm not? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to give you the impression that in every respect things are going in the wrong direction. Even in higher education, although the extreme has gotten more extreme, and you see this politically correct progressive stuff really gone off the deep end, there actually are more people in colleges and universities today who are of a perspective closer to what I've represented here today than there was 40 years ago. But you don't often see that because progressives have become ever more extreme. They're the ones that get all the attention. And they've become more radical in terms of trying to shut down debate. But I know that because we work with them all the time at our foundation, I can point to universities all across the country where now I can say, well, there's at least one or at least two or even a whole department of professors who would defend Western civilization and individual liberty and smaller government and so forth. We got a long ways to go, but that's still better than it was. But keep in mind, one of the core problems with progressivism is that it has within it a strong totalitarian streak. In its proposals, what progressives are saying we should do as a society, you'll find time and again, it's government should do more, which is another way of saying we should have more force in society. We should take more from some, give more to others. We should deploy the police more often to regulate and so forth. They are at the bottom of progressive ideology is a faith in the use of political force. And they tend to think in terms of monopolies. Why do you need more than one deodorant? Why do you need more than one viewpoint? We know we're right. End justifies the means. And that speaks to an even larger problem in my mind, which is a moral character crisis. And maybe I'll just close by saying, because I like to, some people say I harp on this, but I think it's the number one problem that we face. All these other problems that occupy so much of our time, national debt, runaway government, big spending, controls, regulations, what have you, all of that is a manifestation of something more deep-seated, and that is a character crisis in the country. Now you might say, well, looking at crime rates, many of them are down. Isn't our character getting better? But if you had a character index that also, aside from looking at, say, physical violence, but also assessed things like a spirit of independence and self-reliance, versus a willingness to live at the expense of others through political force, there I think you'd find we're slipping. We have more people today than ever in American history who are dependent upon others through the political process and are perfectly happy with it. We have more people who think they're entitled to living at other people's expense, entitled to a free college education in many cases, than perhaps ever before in our history. This, to me, is not just bad economics. It's a character crisis. It says that we've become a people who, in all too many cases, think nothing of taking from others if it's, quote, for a good cause, or for me, or wrap it in whatever kind of velvet you want. But it's basically theft through the use of political force. That's a character problem. Until people understand that the kind of society you really want to live in is one that respects life, property, contract, associations, that elevates things like work, thrift, self-reliance, responsibility, care for each other, not through the government, but through your own efforts and voluntary charity. Until we recognize that and right the ship, all these other problems are only going to get worse. And I've found throughout history, going back to studies on ancient Rome, that no society has ever lost its character and kept its liberties. I've yet to find one. Never found one yet. No society that loses its character, its respect for things like honesty, patience, courage, self-reliance, responsibility, intellectual humility, no society that loses a fealty to those important character traits has ever kept its liberties. No society has ever arisen in liberty that didn't first muster character to get there. That's how those two things are so closely tied. Liberty and character are two sides of the same coin. You can't have one without the other. You lose one, you lose the other. I know of no exception. And that's why at our foundation, and I think this is true at Acton and Mackinac as well, whether it's overt, so stated in our work, or more subtle, I think we all recognize the importance of cultivating a revival of character. And get that fixed, you can fix a lot of other things, but not until.
Given the fact that the Federal Reserve has been with us for just over 100 years now, and the fact that they've presided over probably deeper recessions and more problems, given the history that happened during the Great Depression, how do you think the Federal Reserve will be able to avoid the same fate that happened to the easy money policy, the same fate that happened in the Great Depression?
Yeah, I get that question a lot. And of course, nobody knows the precise answer, but I can tell you this. As a general rule, the more the Federal Reserve, and for a longer and longer period, engineers below market, artificially low interest rates, the more distortions, the more malinvestments, bad investments that you get, the more distortions that ultimately are not sustainable, that must be corrected for in the form of some kind of downturn. How deep and how long that will be when that day comes, nobody knows. But that's not a function of just what the Fed can do. It's also a function of what Congress and the President does. As we learned in the Great Depression, or do, not does. As we learned in the Great Depression, the Fed was a big aggravating factor. It brought on the Depression with its erratic monetary policy, but it was acts of Congress and the President that took a bad situation and kept it from recovering, that made it worse for a lot of years. That's why I keep thinking, if you just plant all the seeds that you can for sound economics, as best you can, especially to young people, well, what more can you do? And hopefully, when the day comes when there are difficult times again because of this erratic monetary policy, maybe they can be short and sweet. Maybe we will say, well, we did that again. We're not going to let that happen again. Let's fix the fundamentals for the first time since 1921. Let's stop this crazy roller coaster monetary policy. And in the face of a sick economy, let's not add to its burdens by jacking up taxes and so forth. Let's do the right thing. You have to hope for that, but we don't know. All I can say is you do your best for what you know to be right and let the chips fall where they may. If I can put a biblical turn to it, I think we all should aspire to accomplish in our lives what we ought to be able to say as we look back on our lives, what the Apostle Paul said the night before his martyrdom, when he said, I have finished the work, I have finished the race, I have fought the fight, I have kept the faith. Did I get it right? Yeah, I have finished, you heard me. In other words, I wasn't perfect, but I did all that I could. Once I knew what the right thing was, I did my best on its behalf. What more can one person do? So I don't know, but I don't fret about it because that'll just slow me down. You just got to do what you know to be right and let the chips fall where they may.
Ladies and gentlemen, join me in thanking Larry.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Larry.